Hola y bienvenidas a Sex and Spanglish, where we empower mujeres to get in touch with their bodies, own their pleasure, and where we discuss all the cochinadas our abuelas didn't tell us about. My name is Ana Lopez. I'm a sexpert, future doctora, certified sex and life coach, proud Latina, and your go-to guide for all things sex. I'm here to help you kick vergüenza to the curb and teach you to have guilt-free sexual pleasure. Basically, I'm here to help you have mind-blowing sex without the guilt and shame you learned to have growing up. Let's be real. La comunidad latina doesn't talk about sex, pero que suerte tienes because this Latina does. It is my vision to have Latinas worldwide discussing sex with one another just like they do with chisme. Así que prepárate. I'm about to change the way you view sex para siempre. Hey y'all, I have a really juicy episode for you today, but before we get into that, I want to share a quick announcement. Quickie calls have existed since the launch of my business in 2020, and over the past almost 5 years, they've had several iterations, but I finally found the one. From here on out, Quickie calls will be 30-minute one-on-one coaching sessions. During these calls, we will go over your biggest sexual struggle, and you'll leave with steps to start solving it as soon as we get off the call. The Quickie call is literally the answer you've been looking for. And the best part is that these are completely free to you. There is a catch though. I will only be offering 4 calls per month. So, if you aren't a current client and you want to book a quickie with me and get the answers you need to solve your biggest sexual struggle, then listen up. Here's how it works. At the beginning of every month, I will make an announcement that the calendar is dropped and you'll have a chance to book a quickie call. All calls are first come, first served, so you'll want to be sure to book ASAP. Once the 4 calls for the month are gone, that's it, and you'll have to wait until the next month to book your quickie call, which means you'll be putting off your results. So be sure to log in as soon as you get the announcement and book your quickie call. You can book your quickie call this month using the link in the show notes. There are only 3 things that you need in order to have mind-blowing sex on demand: an understanding of your body, the ability to effectively communicate that, and the skills of rest and rejuvenation. And in today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into effective communication, and more specifically, communication around triggers that happen during sex. So as promised, if you've listened to the past 2 episodes about communication outside of the bedroom and about communication inside of the bedroom, I had mentioned that triggers can happen and that these conversations can happen in the bedroom, but they can also happen outside of the bedroom, and that I was going to dedicate an entire episode to triggers. So here we are. Also, if you haven't listened to the past 2 episodes about communication outside of the bedroom and communication in the bedroom, you're definitely going to want to go back and listen to those because you may be a little bit lost as you're listening to this. So, as I was saying, in today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into effective communication and specifically talking around triggers that happen during sex. So, before we get into this topic, I want to remind you that while I have a background in therapy, so if you don't know, I went to school to get my MSW, I was going to be a sex therapist, and there was a lot of red tape around therapy and a lot of things that I didn't agree with. I do support therapy, don't get me wrong, but I didn't want to be the one providing therapy. Therapy has its time and place. It's great. I will help you get a licensed therapist if that is what you need, but that was not for me, and that was not the path I chose to take. That said, I am not a licensed therapist, and this podcast or anything that I teach is not a substitute for mental health care. So if you are currently experiencing mental health issues or you happen to experience them while you are listening to this episode, please seek the support of a licensed mental health provider. And if you need support finding one, send me a DM on Instagram at Sex and Spanglish. Again, it's Spanglish, not Spanish, and I will help you find one. I'm actually really good at connecting people with therapists. So anyway, let's get back to the triggers. Let's start by defining what a trigger is, because I think, like with TikTok and other social media platforms, we've come a long way in bringing light to mental health. And there are a lot of people that don't know what the hell they're talking about, that are talking about mental health. And a lot of people just start using words just to use them and not really understanding what they actually mean. So let's just talk about a general trigger, right? Just a regular trigger. A trigger is like a magic button that causes something to happen anytime it's pressed. So think of it like a remote control, right? Anytime you press a specific button, something specific happens. There's a reaction when you press the button. And this is exactly what happens with a trigger, right? But when we consider triggers happening to humans, it's an event that causes a physical reaction. It's an event that causes a physical reaction. So an event can be a sound, a scent, a thought, a location, right? Maybe you're in a specific place or you're reminded of a specific place, which also kind of leans into the thought. A person. Physical reactions are typically emotions. So sadness, anger, anxiety, and even like quote unquote positive emotions like excitement or happiness, right? So again, a trigger, a general trigger, right, is a sound, a scent, a thought, a location, a person even, that when presented to someone, presented to like as stimuli to a person, evokes some type of physical reaction, which is typically an emotion. So sadness, anger, anxiety, excitement, those are just examples, right? But when we think of clinical triggers or triggers that happen in terms of like mental health areas, these are typically connected to things such as PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, or a past trauma of some kind. Now notice that when I'm talking about, as you will see in just a second, or as you will hear in just a second, clinical triggers and general triggers are going to sound very similar. The only difference being that clinical triggers are typically connected to PTSD or some type of past trauma. The important difference that I want to point out here is that general triggers in the way that I'm talking about them happen to everyone, right? You may see someone on the street and then you're filled with like nostalgia or sadness or excitement or something because they remind you of an old lover or your grandma or, you know what I mean? Something like that. Like, triggers happen to everyone. That's just how like the brain works. That's how like we're reminded of things, right? We hear a sound and it reminds you of your favorite TV show, or you smell something and it reminds you of going to your abuela's house or like something like that, right? Like general triggers happen to everybody all the time. The difference with clinical triggers and the way that I'm referring to them, right, is that they are connected specifically to a past trauma and or PTSD. And I don't know why I said and or when PTSD is trauma, but anyway, they're connected to PTSD or some type of past trauma that isn't necessarily PTSD. And the way it can be more, the reaction to the clinical trigger can be more significant in the sense of someone can lose control. Like it's possible for someone to kind of like lose control in these specific scenarios. So if you've never experienced some type of clinical trigger, if you don't experience PTSD, right? If you don't necessarily have any like big T traumas, you may not fully kind of comprehend what I'm saying. You're probably like, these both sound the fucking same. And fair, I get it. But just imagine, for the purposes of this conversation, general triggers are just kind of like catalysts, right? They're just like, oh, something reminds you of something else. It evokes an emotion of you. It evokes an emotion for you. When we think of clinical triggers, they're like, it's something that, it's an event, right? So a sound, scent, thought, location, person, etc., that is kind of reminding you something kind of like bad that happened, or like a bad experience that you may have had. So oftentimes, some examples could be, sexual assault. It could be, we hear people that have gone to war, right? Refugees, immigrants, right? People that have had significant experiences in their lives that were not necessarily positive can have these types of clinical triggers. So triggers impact everyone differently. So it's important to understand your own triggers and how they show up for you. It's also important to identify the support that you need when you are triggered. So this could be from your partner. It could also be from yourself, like things that you need to do for yourself. Now, I'm not going to provide examples because, again, that is not what I'm here for. But you know what works best for you. And if you are having issues being constantly triggered, then that's something that you need to bring up to your current therapist, or you need to connect with the therapist and get that support there. Again, this conversation isn't about how to manage your triggers. It is more so when you are triggered, how to have that conversation with your partner so that is not impeding you from enjoying sex sin vergüenza. So, independent of the type of trigger that you have two choices. So let's imagine you're having sex and you become triggered for whatever reason. It doesn't matter why. The point is that you are triggered. You have two choices. You can either stop having sex or you can keep going. You get to decide. There is no right or wrong answer, and you can change it up. Maybe sometimes you want to keep going. Maybe sometimes you want to stop. Maybe you want to keep going and then you decide you want to stop. Like, it is totally up to you. You get to decide. You have full authority here. So if you want to stop, again, you have full authority to do so. And this is always your call. So what you're going to do, it's like, we'll call it 3.5 steps. So you're going to stop. You're going to stop having sex. If you want to stop, you're going to stop. You're going to regulate yourself. You're going to step out of the bedroom, step out of the scenario, and I want you to give yourself space to regulate yourself. And then when you are regulated, and only when you are regulated, I want you to plan to have the conversation at a later date outside of the bedroom. And you're going to use the techniques in the outside of the bedroom episode. So just to quick recap what the outside of the bedroom conversation looks like is you're going to consent to have the conversation. In this case, you're going to plan to have a conversation at a later date. Explain your experience to the extent that you are comfortable. And there's like one of two things here. There's like two paths you can go down. If you identify the trigger, so if you know what triggered you, you can have a discussion on what happened, what your experience was like, again, to the extent that you are comfortable, and how to avoid that trigger in the future, if at all possible. If you haven't identified the trigger, if you're like, I was triggered and I don't know what the fuck happened, have an open discussion with your partner about it, because having that open discussion might trigger, weirdly enough, trigger you to be like, oh, that's actually what it was. So having that conversation about it, even if you haven't identified what the trigger exactly was, can be super helpful. So again, to summarize, if you are going to stop once you've been triggered, you're going to stop, you're going to regulate yourself, and when you are regulated, and only when you are regulated, you're going to plan to have the conversation at a later date outside of the bedroom. Now, very quickly, before I forget, is if you say like, hey, like let's imagine you're triggered and you want to stop having sex, right? You're going to just say that you want to stop. In that moment, you don't have to give a reason why. You can just be like, oh, like if they ask why, you could just say like, oh, like I need a minute, or I don't want to have sex anymore. I want to stop. Like, you don't have to justify your reason for wanting to stop, but your partner is also in the right to ask why if they want. That said, you don't have to give them an answer. You don't have to go into a full on explanation of what is going on for you. You could share, you know what, something triggered me. I am not sure what it was, or something triggered me, or I'm feeling triggered, or, you know, something along those lines. if you want to, but ultimately the bare minimum is just like, I'm done. Like, I want to stop. That is all you have to say. The further explanation is entirely up to you. My recommendation, though, would be to keep it to a minimum of like, I'm feeling triggered right now. I need to stop, and leave it at that. And go and regulate yourself, because that is the priority in that moment. Okay, let's get into if you want to keep going. So if you want to keep going, you're feeling triggered and you want to keep going, and this is probably more than likely for those of you that are triggered by something that isn't necessarily traumatic of any kind, right? It's just like, oh, like I had this, passing thought or something like that. If you want to keep going, then you're more than welcome to do so. I personally don't think you need to mention a trigger in the moment if you're going to continue the session, but that's ultimately up to you. It is really a decision for you to make. So let's imagine you're having sex and you're like, oh, I want to stop, right? Like I'm feeling triggered. I want to stop. I don't know where I'm going with this. Rewind. So in the moment, you're having sex and you're like, oh, I'm feeling kind of triggered, but kind of want to keep going. You don't have to say, hey, I'm feeling triggered right now, but I want to continue. Like, you see how, to me, this is just my thought about it. It sounds kind of odd. But if you want to share that, you are more than welcome to do so. You get to do whatever the hell that you want. I personally would not do that. And now, actually, that I'm saying all of this out loud, I think I did mention that I was going to share a personal example. So let me go through what to do if you want to continue the conversation. And I will, at the very end of this episode, share some personal examples, because I actually have been triggered during sex and have kept going. And that isn't to say that y'all have to. Again, you can stop. I've also actually stopped as well, but I want to share like what that experience is like to keep going, because that's something that I decided to do. So anyway, if you want to keep going, again, you're more than welcome to do so. You can also decide if you want to have a conversation about it later. If you are triggered in the moment and you decide, you know what, I don't really think it's necessary to have a conversation about this later, then you don't have to, although you might want to. So if you want to have a conversation about it later, then you're simply going to follow the guidelines to having a conversation about it outside the bedroom. So again, you're going to plan to have the conversation at a later date outside of the bedroom using the techniques in the outside the bedroom episode. So again, if you haven't listened to that, definitely go back and listen to that episode, because I go further in depth to like what that would look like and sound like. But very briefly, you're going to consent to having the conversation. And in this case, plan to have the conversation at a later date. You're going to explain your experience to the extent that you are comfortable. And if you've identified the trigger, have a discussion on how to avoid it in the future. If you weren't able to identify it, again, having an open discussion about it to see if you can identify it. So as you'll notice, these two scenarios are very similar, and they do revolve around conversations, but ultimately it's up for you to decide. It really is. And I know you are probably hating that I'm telling you this, that it is up to you, but it really is. You might find that sometimes you want to, like, something is more helpful than another. And I don't want to ever tell you that there is one right way to do something, because there simply isn't. I don't know your experience, only you know that. And so it's ultimately up for you to decide to see how you want to do things. And I just want you to know that I fully support whatever decision it is that you make when you are feeling triggered in the bedroom. Okay. So now into the examples. Now that I've talked about both of the scenarios, actually really quickly before I get into examples, I want to quickly summarize what I just talked about. So again, you have two choices when it comes to being triggered during sex. You can either stop or you can keep going. If you decide to stop having sex, regulate yourself, and then plan to have the conversation later using the outside of the bedroom techniques. If you decide to keep going, mention it if you want, and then have the conversation at a later date. And also, if there is some type of regulation needed, definitely do that as well. As always, care for yourself. So, on to the examples before I end this episode. There are specific words that are a bit of a trigger for me. I would say that these words are connected to trauma, so it is an assault. I wouldn't say that I get extremely triggered by them. Like my reaction when hearing these words is not necessarily, it's not like this huge reaction that I experience. It's just like kind of like an ick that I don't like. And so I have had actually a few partners that have used specific words, and I'm not going to say the words here because that's, one, not relevant, and two, I don't want to talk about it. So there's a specific words, or like a set of words, phrase that is used or that has been used actually by a few partners now that I'm thinking about it. And I've had to ask them not to use that phrase during sex, or at all for that matter, but particularly during sex. And so in that case, I would just say, like, don't say that, or say something else. I have done both of those, of like, don't say that, or like say something else, particularly when I wanted to continue, and I have continued. And then later on, I would have that conversation with them. Now that I'm revisiting this and saying this out loud, don't say that is typically not very effective. I would just, if I were actually not triggered in the moment, I would probably have redirected them, right? And you can go back to the in the bedroom episode to learn about redirection. But I would have redirected them if I wasn't triggered in that moment. But again, it was kind of like, okay, I need to get away from this phrase. That's kind of like what my experience was of like hearing the phrase. I need to kind of like get away from this phrase, or like distance myself from this phrase, and at the same time still having the ganas to want to continue the session. And so if I were to have been in a more regulated state, I probably would have just redirected. But again, I had a conversation, excuse me, with my partner about this after the fact. And so, we planned to have a conversation, and I was like, hey, I want to talk to you about something that happened. And I explained my experience and explained why I don't like those words. And that's because that felt good for me. I didn't have to have that conversation. But in my mind, I really wanted to share why those words were not something that I wanted to hear, particularly in the moment, right, while I'm having sex with somebody. And in the hopes that it would kind of like make them understand more, and try to remember harder, right? Because if it's just like something that's like an annoyance to me or kind of gives me an ick, I felt like maybe they would be like less likely to remember, and it wouldn't be as like big of a deal per se, whereas like, no, like this is actually kind of like re-traumatizing me, then that's like another story, right? It's kind of like a more higher level of importance, and so it was important for me to share that. Now, the partners that this happened with, after the conversation, they could have just decided to continue doing it deliberately, or continually doing it for whatever reason, right? And then I would have then had the full authority to say, like, okay, I don't want to have sex with this person anymore. And if I was in a relationship with them, that I could decide that I didn't want to have that relationship anymore. But having the conversation, again, gives you so much information to go off of. I was able to see how they reacted to me sharing this with them, and how they reacted after the fact when, we had sex again. So that was just my experience of like continuing, the session when I was triggered, again, it wasn't, while it is connected to more of like a big T trauma, I have really like, it's old, and not that that really matters, but I've worked through it. And so there's not, it wasn't a huge reaction. There have been times where I have had larger reactions, but those have happened like outside of sex. And so, yeah, so it was a little bit different how I navigated that. But in this particular instance, or in these particular instances, because it has happened more than once, I haven't found myself to be super triggered. And so I've just decided to continue. And I could have also stopped if I wanted to. So I hope you found this episode helpful. Again, if you are in need of mental health support, if you are having trouble managing your triggers, then definitely seek out mental health support. Send me a DM at Sex and Spanglish, and I'll be more than happy to connect you with a licensed therapist.